And welcome back. We are now going to look at transformations specifically with our objects here in Blender. Now we go ahead and created a brand new workspace here. So we have, of course, just this regular plain old cube. And last time we went and looked at the cursor option, which allowed us to kind of tack other shapes onto here. But if you notice, we have other options here too. We have move, rotate, scale, and transform. And if I click on, for example, transform, which is a combination of the ones above, you can see we get a bunch of different arrows and indicators on here. Now, if we look at these colors here, so we have a blue, green, red, you'll see that they correspond with our different axes here. So we have our red, our green, and our blue. So that's our X, Y, and Z coordinates, and we can see that right here as well. So if we look up here in this indicator, you can see that the Z-axis, or Z as it sometimes is called, is vertical. So this is the up and down. We have our Y-axis, which is of course kind of running left and right, and our X, which is running front and back. So that gives us a nice good visual indication of what each of these little pieces here are representing. Now the cool thing is that with these different pieces here, you'll see that we have the arrows and that we have also kind of these little cubes inside of here. So for example, if I were to grab this blue one, you'll notice if I go over, it says that it's a scale. I can click and drag that and it'll scale it in the vertical direction. If I were to grab this red one, it will allow me to scale this in the X direction. So I can go ahead and scale that accordingly. Green, same thing. I can scale that in the green direction. All right. And if I were to grab the arrows, you can see that it effectively allows us to move it. So this allows me to move this in this direction. This arrow allowed me to move it up, etc. And then the bars here, the little arcs you see, are what allows me to actually to rotate this. So I can actually go ahead and rotate this object here in space. Now, of course, if I want to deselect that, I just simply click off. And if I ever want to get back to working with more transforms, all I need to do is click back on that shape. Now, the cool thing with this is that this is not simply just applied to the mesh shapes. If I click on my camera, you can see that we also get options here. So for example, I can move this camera up here vertically and have it kind of pan with this. So we have, of course, a bunch of different options here available to us when we start working in this three-dimensional space. Now, using these little indicators here is only one way to kind of control the different properties. Let's just look at our light real quick here. And there's several different ways. You can, of course, you can see we have our transform panel right here. So I can come in here and type values in, or I can press this little arrow that's up here and it'll bring up the transform menu as well. And then what we can do is we can actually come in here and type in values. So for example, I can type in 1, maybe we want these all to be 1, or maybe we want this last one to be like 1.5. So you can easily come in here and type in different numbers. And of course, you can still manipulate these by scrolling them, just like we saw when we did the adding of the objects. And the other cool thing you can do is you can actually come in here and select multiples here. So if you really want to. Of course, you only have 3 field values here, so it's not very hard to come in here and just manipulate it, but you can select more than one if you so desire. Now, one thing I want to kind of take a moment to explore is some of our other tools here. So for example, our move key. You can see we also have a shortcut there for G. So if I were to go back to this, let's just go to our selection tool real quick. Make sure we have our rectangular prism here. It was a cube, it's not anymore. Have that selected. I'm just going to go ahead and press G. And you can see that we can now just kind of freely move this around, all right, in the X, Y, or Z. But a cool thing we can do is we can also restrict that. So for example, if I hold down the X key, you can see now it will restrict it to being in the X direction, so I can move that accordingly. Or if I were to press the Y key, we now are restricting to the Y direction. Same thing with Z, it will restrict that to moving in the Z direction. So again, a pretty cool feature that we can easily manipulate here in Blender. So, and of course, you notice if I press Z twice, it also brought up kind of a diagonal that I can kind of manipulate here. Pressing again just takes me back to regular G. And if I need to get off that, I can just simply right click or click anywhere outside the space here to kind of deselect that. So again, pressing G, click off, I can then deselect it and it will stay wherever I had it in my position. So a pretty neat feature there. Or you can always grab here on the move button itself, and then we have the ability to manipulate this using the various arrows that we are already familiar with from our transform. Now, one other thing I want to show with restrictions into movement here, if I go back to my move function here, let's just press G here just so we got some free movement. And if I were to, let's say I only want this to move in the X and Y, let's say I'm perfectly happy where it is in the Z direction. If I press Shift Z, you'll see that I can still move it freely within the X and Y, but I can no longer move this within the Z direction. So it is another way to restrict this. All right, and of course, pressing again gives us some other options there. But one thing I do want to point out, let me just go ahead and click this off. If I press Shift Z without first going to that G mode, you'll notice that we change our viewing here. All right, we are no longer in the same viewpoint that we were before. So if that happens, just press Shift Z to toggle between it. You want to make sure you always press G first, and then you can restrict that in your X and Y directions. And just real quick, let's look at these other ones. So of course we have the scale option, which simply just allows us to scale this. So we can of course easily scale this in different directions here, however we want to do it. And of course we also have rotate, which again allows us to rotate this within the plane here. So a pretty cool and easy feature to use there. Now if I just go ahead and use my mouse wheel here, I'm just going to click and drag this just to rotate. You can see how this shape is being exhibited within the different planes here. Let me go back to transform just so we can see that. And you can see we are, of course, below the XY axis here because we have a little bit of that shape within the Z. And this shape is pretty cool here. And the fact that we were able just to create something that wasn't just a basic cube, we made it kind of more of a rectangular prism simply by using these 4 simple tools here. Now, the last thing I want to remind you of is up here we do, of course, have our transforms that we can come in here and manipulate values in here as well. So for example, if I want to change this X rotation to, let's say, 0, and I press enter, you will see that it has transformed that rotation there as well. So it's a pretty cool way there. Now, of course, we also, under the object menu here, we have transforms as well. So we have the ability to access things like move, rotate, scale, etc. So we, of course, have more abilities to access things. So even if we can't remember where these specific things are, we can still come in here to be able to freely kind of play around with them. Now, what I want you to do is to go ahead and challenge yourself just a little bit here. Go ahead and see if you can create a second object that's going to go in here with our first one. And what I want you to do is set it up so that way your second object, and you can do another cube if you want, or you can do a sphere or something like that, but try to set it so your Z-axis is set to 1. You can set the X and Y however you want. I want you to rotate it at least, let's say, 45 degrees about the X, and let's do a negative direction here for the Y. So because you can do a negative rotation. Well, so let's do a negative 45 on the Y, and go ahead and apply a scale factor of at least maybe 2, or maybe a fractional value to your X, Y, and Z. Because I want you to see what kind of unique shape you can make just with this one additional shape.